He thought he could scare me into giving up the one thing I had left, my own son, the boy I once carried on my hip, now standing taller than me, demanding I surrender my home like it was some bargaining chip. He thought age made me weak. But he forgot. This house was built on every sacrifice I ever made, and I wasn't about to let him strip it from me. Before I go further, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Lorraine Parker. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in this house for nearly 5 decades. It has been my anchor, my memory keeper, and in many ways, my last companion. Before I share this story, let me ask, where are you watching from tonight? I want to know who's with me as I tell you how betrayal can cut the deepest when it comes from your own flesh and blood. This house wasn't always what it is now. When my late husband Richard and I first bought the land, it was nothing but dirt and wild grass. A broken-down shed sat in the corner, leaning like it was too tired to stand. But Richard had a dream, and I believed in it as much as I believed in him. We saved every penny, stretching meals with soup and bread, patching up our clothes, saying no to luxuries. Every Friday, I'd put a $5 bill into a jar marked House Fund. Slowly, brick by brick, room by room, we built a place that wasn't just shelter, it was us. I still remember the night we moved in, when the walls were barely painted, and the floors creaked like they were learning to hold us. Richard brought home a single bottle of cheap champagne, and we toasted to a future we hadn't yet seen. "This house will outlive us, Lorraine," he said with a grin. "It'll hold our children, and maybe even their dreams." And for a time, it did. When my son, David, was born, his crib sat in the very room where I now keep my sewing machine. I would rock him by the window, humming softly, while Richard worked on sealing the roof above us. Every corner of this home holds a memory. David's first steps across the kitchen tiles, his laughter echoing down the hallway when he played hide and seek with his cousins, even his teenage stomps when he slammed his door after we refused to buy him a new car. Yes, we had our fights. But back then, they were the kind that ended in hugs. He was my boy, my pride, my reason for putting up with double shifts at the hospital and cutting corners just to keep him fed, clothed, and prepared for college. But life changes people. Somewhere between becoming a man and building his own family, David changed. Or maybe he was always this way, and I was too blinded by a mother's love to see it. After Richard passed, the house felt emptier, but it also felt like my last connection to him. David promised he'd look after me, check in on me, make sure I was okay. And for a while he did. He'd come around, mow the lawn, fix the gutters. I thought maybe he was stepping into his father's shoes. But then came the requests. First it was a loan, then another. Then his wife, Melissa, started dropping hints that maybe I was better off in a smaller place, that this house was too much for me. I brushed it off as casual talk. Families joke, don't they? But the tone shifted. The visits became less about seeing me, more about what I could give, and the warmth I once saw in my son's eyes was replaced with calculation. The moment it all turned became clear one Sunday afternoon. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared birthday cakes and Sunday stews. He didn't smile. He didn't ask how I was doing. Instead, he leaned forward and said, "Mum, you need to sign this house over to me. It's time." I laughed at first, thinking he was joking, but his face didn't move. His eyes were cold. That's when the ache began in my chest. Not from fear of losing the house, but from realizing the son I raised, the boy I once protected from every scrape and storm, now saw me as nothing more than an obstacle. I tightened my grip on the teacup in my hand and said softly, "This house is mine, David. It will stay mine until the day I take my last breath." But he only smirked, and in that smirk I saw the storm that was coming. The silence that followed my refusal that afternoon didn't last long. David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, and for a moment I could see the little boy he once was, the one who used to pout when I told him he couldn't have another cookie. But this wasn't childish sulking. It was something sharper, more dangerous. "Mum," he said, his voice low but firm, "this isn't up for debate. You've had your time here. You can't keep up with this place anymore. Melissa and I need it now. It's better for everyone. Better for everyone." The words stung like a slap. Everyone, it seemed, meant him, his wife, and their children, not me. I tried to reason with him. "David, I may be old, but I'm not helpless. This house is where I belong. Your father and I built it with our hands. You think I'd just hand it over like a set of old clothes you don't want anymore?" His smirk hardened into something uglier. "You're being selfish. Melissa and I are drowning, Mom. 2 kids in private school, bills piling up, and you're sitting here in this big house and all alone. Don't you think the kids deserve to grow up here instead of cramped in our little place across town? You don't need all this space. You don't even use half the rooms." I stared at him, shocked at the brazenness. The house wasn't just space. It was memory, history, blood, sweat, and love. To him, though, it was just square footage and equity. "David," I whispered, "you can't demand something that isn't yours." But he slammed his hand on the table, making the teacup rattle against its saucer. His voice rose, echoing off the walls. "It's going to be mine one way or another. Either you sign it over, or I'll make sure you're out. You're old, Mom. The courts won't let someone like you manage all this alone. I'll get the papers drawn. Don't think I won't." I felt the air leave my lungs. My own son, threatening me with legal action. My David. Melissa's voice joined the chorus days later. She called me on the phone, her tone honeyed but sharp beneath the surface. "Lorraine," she said, "you know we love you, but this isn't healthy. You're clinging to the past. David's right. It's time. Sign the house over, and you'll always have a place with us." A place with them. I imagined myself stuffed into a spare room, treated like baggage they couldn't quite get rid of. No garden, no sewing corner, no memories. Just me, reduced to a burden in their home. I told her no, as firmly as I could, but her sigh told me this wasn't the end of it. After that, the campaign began. Subtle at first, then cruel. David stopped mowing the lawn when he came by. He forgot to help with the broken light fixtures. Melissa whispered in front of me to the children, "Grandma's house is going to be ours soon. Won't that be fun?" The kids, too young to know better, nodded excitedly, already planning which rooms they'd take. I'd walk through my own home and feel like a ghost, like they were already erasing me from it. One evening, David stood in the doorway, arms folded, his voice stripped of any pretense of love. "You're not hearing me, Mum. You either hand it over or we'll get it through the court. Don't test me." I remember gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. His eyes were hard, unrecognizable. My son, the boy who once cried into my chest after scraping his knee, was now looking at me as if I were his enemy. I wanted to scream, to remind him of every sacrifice I'd ever made for him. The nights I went without so he could have shoes for school. The years of double shifts so he could go to college. But the words lodged in my throat, because I realized something chilling. To him, those sacrifices no longer mattered. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of Richard. He would have known what to say, how to protect me from this storm. I closed my eyes and whispered to the empty room, "What do I do, Richard? How do I fight our own son?" The answer didn't come in words. It came in the steady thud of my heart, reminding me that I wasn't finished yet. David thought I was weak, that age had stripped me of strength. But he was wrong. He had just declared war and he didn't even realize it. After that ultimatum, everything shifted. My home, the place that had once been my sanctuary, began to feel like a battlefield. David and Melissa weren't just pushing anymore. They were plotting. And the first weapon they reached for wasn't a lawyer's letter. It was gossip. At first, it was little things I heard secondhand. My neighbor Marlene mentioned, almost offhand, that David had told her I was having trouble keeping up with things. A cousin I rarely spoke to called me suddenly, asking if I was doing all right alone. Their voices carried the same pitying tone, as if they were rehearsing lines someone else had fed them. Soon, it wasn't just whispers. It was conversations I overheard at family dinners. "She forgets things all the time now," Melissa said one evening when she thought I was out of earshot. "Bills, appointments, simple things. It's sad, really." I stood there in the hallway, my hands tightening around the serving dish I carried, the words sinking in like poison. I wanted to shout that I paid every bill on time, that I still balanced my checkbook better than most people half my age. But instead, I set the dish down quietly and forced a smile. Inside, I was breaking. They began treating me differently too. Melissa spoke to me slowly, as though I couldn't follow her words. David started making decisions in my house without asking, changing light bulbs, moving furniture, even suggesting I stop cooking because it was too much for me. Every little action chipped away at my dignity. One Sunday, Melissa leaned across the table and said, "Lorraine, wouldn't it be better if you moved in with us? That way, you wouldn't have to worry about the house at all." Her smile was practiced, but her eyes gleamed with victory. I pushed my plate back and said evenly, "I'm not moving anywhere. This is my home." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Even my grandchildren, sweet as they were, looked down at their plates, sensing the tension. But the worst wasn't what they said to me. It was what they said about me. At church, I noticed glances, whispers that stopped when I passed. Mrs. Callahan, who I'd sung beside in the choir for years, asked gently if I needed someone to help me with errands. I thanked her, but my heart sank. The rumors were working. The isolation was crushing. Friends who once visited often grew distant, unsure of what was true. Some probably thought they were sparing me embarrassment by not bringing it up, but their absence cut just as deep. The phone that used to ring with invitations grew silent. At night, I sat in the quiet house, listening to the creak of the walls and the tick of the clock, and I wondered if this was their plan all along, to make me so lonely, so unsure of myself, that I'd finally give in and sign the house away. But then I'd wander through the rooms, running my fingers over the framed photos, the marks on the wall, where David's height had been measured year after year. And I remembered Richard's voice, deep and steady. "This house will outlive us, Lorraine." That memory gave me strength. I realized I couldn't let their lies define me. If David was determined to drag me into court, then I needed to be ready. I picked up the phone one morning and called Mr. Thompson, an old family friend who had practiced law for decades. His voice on the other end was warm, reassuring. "Lorraine," he said, "you've still got more fight in you than most people I know. Don't you worry. If he wants a battle, we'll give him one." For the first time in weeks, I exhaled fully. I wasn't alone after all. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where David had demanded my home, and spread out every important paper I had. Medical records, bills, the deed, even letters Richard had left me about the property. My hands shook, but not from fear, from determination. David thought isolating me would make me weak. He didn't know it was making me sharper, clearer, more ready. Because if he wanted to take this house through lies, I would answer him with truth. The knock came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't the friendly rap of a neighbor or the soft hand of a grandchild. It was sharp, official. By the time I opened the door, the man standing there was already handing me an envelope, his expression blank, businesslike. "Mrs. Parker?" he asked. "Yes," I said slowly. "You've been served." My fingers trembled as I took the envelope. The man was already walking away before I could ask a single question. The weight of the papers felt heavier than it should have, like betrayal stuffed into every fold. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where David had issued his ultimatum weeks earlier, and carefully slid the documents out. My eyes darted across the words, trying to make sense of them, until the meaning landed like a punch to the chest. Petition for power of attorney. David was trying to declare me unfit to manage my own affairs. My son, the child I had raised, fed, clothed, defended, was now standing in front of a judge, insisting that I was incompetent, that I couldn't handle my own life. I pressed a hand to my chest, fighting back the rising panic. The words blurred. It was as though every whisper, every rumor Melissa had planted, was now etched in black ink on legal paper. Elder vulnerability, lack of capacity, need for guardianship. Words that didn't belong to me. Words that didn't match the woman who still cooked her meals, paid her bills, and tended her garden. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the paper. My heart ached. Not just for what was happening, but for what it meant. David hadn't just given up on me. He wanted to erase me. The phone sat on the counter, silent. I picked it up and dialed the only number I trusted. "Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice unsteady. "I've just been served papers." There was a pause on the other end, then his calm, steady voice. "Bring them to me, Lorraine. Don't panic. He's overreached. And that's where we'll catch him." I drove to his office that afternoon, the papers clutched in my hand. Mr. Thompson, grey-haired but sharp-eyed, laid them out on his desk. He adjusted his glasses, reading each line with the patience of a man who had seen too many family wars. When he finally looked up, his mouth tightened into a firm line. "He's trying to take control of everything. Your bank accounts, your medical decisions, your house. If this goes through, Lorraine, you won't even be able to sign your own checks without his approval." The words made me feel small, as though I were being erased from my own life. But Mr. Thompson reached across the desk, resting his hand lightly on mine. "The good news is, he doesn't have a case. You're competent, organized, and independent. We'll get a doctor's evaluation, pull your financial records, gather everything that proves you're managing just fine. Let him bring this to court. We'll be ready." That night, I sat in my living room with a stack of folders spread across the coffee table. Medical checkups, prescriptions, receipts, tax returns, all in neat order, proof that I was far from helpless. With every paper I added to the pile, I felt a little stronger, a little less like the victim David hoped I'd become. Still, there were moments of weakness. I'd catch sight of the family photos on the wall, the ones where David grinned with frosting on his chin at his 5th birthday party, or stood proudly in his graduation gown, and I'd feel the sting of betrayal all over again. How had we gotten here? How had love turned into this? But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford sentimentality, not now. The weeks leading up to the hearing were the longest of my life. Melissa stopped calling. David didn't visit. But I could feel their presence in the silence, like shadows circling the edges of my home. Neighbors watched me curiously, some with pity, others with suspicion, as if wondering whether the rumors were true. I held my head high. Every morning I tended the garden. I paid bills on time. I cooked my meals. I made sure anyone watching would see a woman who was not weak, not frail, not confused. One evening, as I locked the front door, I whispered into the quiet hallway, "Richard, if you're watching, give me strength." The strength came, not as a voice, but as a steady calm that settled in my chest. Because when the day came to stand in court, I knew one thing for certain. David thought he was stripping me of everything, but he had no idea what I was about to show him. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where lives are decided in whispers and signatures. I walked in slowly, my heels clicking against the floor, clutching the folder Mr. Thompson had prepared. Every step echoed in my ears, reminding me that this was not just about four walls and a roof. This was about my dignity, my right to exist, without being erased. David was already there. He stood tall, his suit pressed, his smile smug. Melissa sat beside him, her hand on his arm, whispering like they were sharing a victory before the game had even begun. When his eyes landed on me, I saw no warmth, no hesitation, just calculation. "Mrs. Parker," the clerk called, and I rose, my knees stiff but steady. David's lawyer began first, a slick man in an expensive tie. He painted me as though I were a relic of the past, confused, incapable, a burden. He spoke of concern for my well-being, using words like vulnerable and fragile phrases, carefully chosen to make me seem like a woman on the brink of collapse. Melissa dabbed her eyes with a tissue as he spoke, as though the performance required tears. David nodded solemnly, as though this betrayal was an act of love. My blood boiled, but I stayed silent. When the judge turned to David, he stepped forward. His voice was smooth, confident. "Your Honor, I'm only trying to do what's best for my mother. She's not the same. She forgets things. She leaves the stove on. She can't keep this house. My wife and I are willing to step in, to protect her, to take the responsibility she can't manage anymore." The lies cut through me, sharp as glass. I wanted to scream that I'd never once left the stove on, that I'd just balanced my checkbook that very morning, that the only thing I'd forgotten was how blind love had made me to his greed. But I didn't scream. I waited. Finally, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Parker, do you have anything to say?" I rose slowly, clutching the folder. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from the weight of what was about to unfold. "Your Honor," I said clearly, "I may be 72, but I am not helpless. I pay my own bills, I cook my meals, I tend my garden, I drive myself where I need to go. I am not vulnerable, I am simply old. There is a difference." I handed the judge the medical evaluations Mr. Thompson had secured. They showed me in good health, my mind sharp. I passed over financial records, neatly organized, every bill paid on time, every check written in my own hand. I even produced a recent letter from my bank, praising my accuracy in handling my accounts. The judge flipped through the papers, nodding slightly. Then Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his voice firm. "Your Honor, what we have here is not concern for an elderly woman. What we have here is greed. Mr. Parker is attempting to seize control of assets that are not his. He and his wife have spread rumors to create the illusion of incompetence, but the evidence speaks for itself. Mrs. Parker is more than capable, and this house, this property, is hers and hers alone." David's face tightened. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Parker," the judge said, "do you have documentation of ownership?" "Yes, Your Honor." I pulled out the deed, the original copy Richard and I had signed all those years ago, my husband's name inked beside mine, the proof of our life's work. My throat tightened as I placed it before the court. But then came the twist David hadn't expected. Mr. Thompson pointed to a clause Richard had insisted on decades earlier. In the event of one spouse's passing, full ownership reverts solely to the surviving spouse, irrevocable. The judge read it aloud. David's face paled. Melissa's hand slipped from his arm. "This deed," the judge said firmly, "leaves no room for dispute. Ownership remains with Mrs. Parker. The petition for power of attorney is denied." For a heartbeat, silence filled the courtroom. Then the clerk lifted the deed, walked to the bench, and handed it back to me. The weight of it in my hands was more than paper. It was proof that I had survived the storm, that truth had beaten lies. I looked at David. The smug smile was gone. In its place was something raw and shaken. Anger, maybe, or humiliation. Whatever it wasn't victory. I held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the judge, my voice steady. "Thank you, Your Honor." The courtroom emptied slowly, the shuffle of footsteps and murmurs fading into the hallway. But I stayed seated for a moment, my hands gripping the deed like it was both shield and sword. After all the months of whispers, accusations, and fear, here it was, returned to me by the very system David thought he could use against me. The clerk had placed it gently in my hands, but the weight of it felt immense. Like Richard himself had reached down through time and steadied me. I could almost hear his voice in the back of my mind, calm and certain. "I told you this house would outlive us, Lorraine." When I finally rose, my knees no longer felt heavy. They carried me across the courtroom floor with quiet strength. David was still there, standing stiff near the benches, his jaw clenched so tightly a vein pulsed at his temple. Melissa whispered frantically in his ear, her face pale, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. I paused in front of him, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I needed him to see me, really see me, not the weak caricature he had tried to paint in front of a judge. "This house is mine, David," I said softly but firmly, not because of the paper in my hand, but because I lived it, I built it, I bled for it. You can't erase that. He looked at me then, eyes dark and unreadable. "You've made a mistake, Mum," he muttered. "You'll regret this." I shook my head slowly. "No, David. The only mistake was thinking you could take from me what you never earned." Melissa tugged at his arm, urging him toward the door, but I stood tall until they left. When the heavy doors swung closed behind them, I exhaled, not in relief, because the pain of his betrayal still clung to me, but in something deeper. Resolution. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled across the courthouse steps. Mr. Thompson walked beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You did beautifully, Lorraine. You carried yourself with dignity. That's something your son couldn't steal, no matter how hard he tried." I nodded, blinking back tears. Dignity. Yes, that was the word for it. Back home, I walked through each room slowly, the deed still in my hand. The living room, where Richard and I had danced barefoot after our anniversary dinner. The hallway lined with photos of David at every age. The kitchen, where the tables still bore faint scratches from years of meals and homework. This was more than a house. It was proof of a life lived, of sacrifices made and battles won. And now it was still mine. But victory came at a cost. That night, as I sat in my armchair, the television humming softly in the background, I realized the silence felt heavier than ever. I had won the deed, but I had lost something I never thought I'd lose. My son's love, or maybe the illusion of it. I closed my eyes and let the thought wash over me. Sometimes victory isn't triumph. Sometimes it's survival. The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Word spread quickly. Small towns have a way of passing news faster than wildfire. Neighbors who had once looked at me with pity now stopped by with warm smiles and kind words. "Good for you, Lorraine," Marlene said, bringing over a basket of muffins. "I always knew you had more sense than the rumors made out." Even Mrs. Callahan from church clasped my hand tightly one Sunday. "I'm sorry I ever doubted you. I should have asked you directly, not listened to whispers." It was comforting, yes, but it didn't erase the deeper wound. Because while neighbors were offering muffins and apologies, my phone stayed silent where David's number should have been. One afternoon, though, he did come. He stood at my doorstep, shoulders slumped, his eyes tired. For a moment, I saw the boy he once was, the one who used to run up these very steps with skinned knees, calling Mum, as though I could fix everything. "Mum," he began, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Melissa said—" I cut him off gently. "No, David. You meant every word you said. Maybe Melissa pushed you. maybe she didn't. But you chose to try and strip me of everything. You chose lies. That was you, not her." He flinched at my words. His mouth opened as if to argue, but nothing came. He stared at me for a long moment, then muttered, "You'll be sorry when you're alone." And then he left. I stood in the doorway, my heart breaking all over again. Alone. Yes, perhaps I would be. But better to be alone in truth than surrounded by people who wanted to bury me while I was still alive. In the weeks that followed, I began to reclaim myself. I hired a gardener to help with the heavier work outside, proving to myself and anyone watching that I could still run this home on my terms. I started sewing again, making quilts for the church charity drive. And slowly, the house filled with laughter again. Not David's, but from neighbors, friends, and even the little ones from church who came by to visit. One evening, I invited a few close friends for tea. We sat around the table, the deed tucked safely in a drawer nearby, and I raised my cup. "This house," I said, "isn't just mine. It's a story of resilience. It's proof that no matter who tries to take your dignity, you hold on, even if it's your own child." The women nodded, some with tears in their eyes. And for the first time in a long while, I felt less like a victim, and more like what Richard always believed I was: strong. David may have walked away that day in court with a broken smile, but I walked back into my home with my head held high. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance I would leave behind. Not just a house, but a lesson. The house is quiet again now, but it's not the heavy silence it once was. It's a calm kind of quiet, the kind that lets you breathe, the kind that reminds you that survival itself is a kind of triumph. I often sit by the window in the evenings, the same spot where I used to rock David as a baby, and I think about how life comes full circle in the strangest ways. He tried to take this house from me, but in the process he lost something far greater: my trust, my respect, the bond we once shared. And yet, I don't hate him. Hate would make me small. Instead, I've chosen strength. This house remains mine, not just because of a piece of paper or a judge's ruling, but because it holds every moment of my life. The laughter, the tears, the love that built its walls. To anyone listening, I'll leave you with this. Never let anyone, not even family, strip you of your dignity. Age doesn't make you weak. Betrayal doesn't make you broken. And a house is never just a house. It's the story of who you are. My son walked out of that courtroom with his pride shattered, but I walked home with my deed, my dignity, and my head held high. And sometimes, that's enough.